Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The Iraq War, and we're going to talk about 5 terms that, as you read more about this conflict and you read more about the time period, use these as kind of a way just to get started when it comes to your own research and analysis about the conflict. So, let's get into it. Before we get to our terms, I figured I would share something. So, these are a deck of cards. Now, you may be wondering, why does Saddam Hussein look like he has his own deck of cards? Well, there's a few reasons for that. First, it's not just him. If you open these cards up, you will see, of course, the camouflaged background, but you'll also see these were issued to U.S. soldiers at the beginning of the invasion of Iraq, which took place in the spring of 2003. And the use of these reflected a commonly done thing, when it comes to U.S. forces and in America. If you want to convey something, or if you want the public to be interested in something, do it in a way that the public engages with. Nearly 20 years prior, in the time period of the first Gulf War, in 1990-91, the U.S. military had gotten together with trading card companies, and it actually, on the eve of that war, created trading cards for the public to be interested in and develop an appreciation of the military. These perhaps were a bit different. So that generation who got these cards when they were younger, they were now going to war. And so the idea would be they could use these as a way potentially to find members of the Iraqi army or leaders of the Iraqi government. So the first term for us is going to be the Bush Doctrine, or the Preemption Doctrine. So in the late 1990s and early 2000s, you had a portion of the conservative movement in the United States, when it came to foreign policy, develop a fairly aggressive view. And that view was formalized by President George W. Bush and many of the members of his foreign policy team. And generally, especially in the aftermath of 9/11, what the Bush Doctrine essentially meant was that if the United States government and if the United States perceives you as a nation-state actor or a non-state actor to be a potential existential threat, to the security of the United States or its allies, that the United States would have grounds for carrying out action against you. Now, that is important because it influences the diplomatic tenor of what happens between the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in the fall of 2001 in the aftermath of 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq in the spring of 2003. That brings us to point number 2, which is WMD. Now, I'm of an age where I was in my early 20s when all of this was happening, and if you were to have turned on the news or read the paper at the time, you would have heard the acronym WMD. You would have heard it a lot. And it stands for Weapons of Mass Destruction. So in early 2002, and then for about a year, the Bush administration attempted to make a case both to the United States and to the international community that weapons of mass destruction, so chemical weapons and others, possibly nuclear weapons, were being produced in the nation of Iraq, and that they were being produced in secret, that they were being produced in violation of United Nations sanction. And the phrase that was often used by the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, former General Colin Powell, was that Iraq was in what he called material breach. So when the United States made the decision to invade with the support of its British allies in March of 2003. Part of what we were attempting to tell the international community was that we were doing this because of the threat that Iraq posed in terms of terrorism, certainly, but also especially because of WMD. Now, the difficult part of this, of course, was that given the fact that the intelligence, it seems, ultimately was quite faulty, that the U.S. was led astray. And the U.S. then does not find WMD. That brings us to our third point, which is shock and awe. Shock and awe. So in the spring of 2003, as the United States begins its invasion, one of the things that it does is it makes use of its vast military arsenal and carries out a very, very heavy guided munitions strike in Baghdad, essentially, and in other areas, that was called the Shock and Awe Campaign, where essentially the United States wanted to be able to take out the Iraqi army and government's main military leadership, having told Saddam Hussein he had like 48 hours to leave the country and that kind of thing. And we send, a couple hundred missiles, dozens of missiles, to these sites, kind of all at once. And the coordinated attack in Shock and Awe really kind of demonstrated the power and prominence of the U.S. military at the time. In the aftermath of the invasion and the success of the invasion in which the Iraqi government is toppled, this brings us to our fourth point, which is the Coalition Provision Authority, or CPA. Now, the Coalition Provisional Authority, led by the summer of 2003 for about the next year by a man named L. Paul Bremer, was functionally the U.S. government, the coalition government of Iraq, until the U.S. supported and approved a new Iraqi government. Now, the Coalition Provisional Authority does a number of things, two biggies for us to take note of. One, it's the Coalition Provisional Authority that issues what was called the de-Baathification Order, so to essentially eliminate the Ba'athist Party in Iraq, which had a number of difficulties. The second thing is that it disbands the Iraqi army. All right, it disbands the Iraqi army. Now, fairly famously, even though the United States claimed material victory in Iraq within a couple of months, resistance in Iraq on the part of a number of groups against the presence of U.S. authority, then eventually other fighters coming into Iraq and engaging in conflict against the U.S., meant that the conflict in Iraq devolved into an insurgent war that raged for at least 7 years. That brings us to our fifth point, which is called the surge. The surge. So U.S. military strategists and planners, General David Petraeus among them, the leaders of this, in 2007 get approval after the study from the Iraqi Working Group to support what was a surge of U.S. troops to counter rising insurgency in the country. We're looking at approximately 20,000 individuals here. And their role in counterinsurgency operations, especially around Baghdad and security in Al-Anbar province, resulted in some fairly high casualties for the United States military, and also by the time you get to 2008, a sort of increase in security throughout parts of Iraq. As a direct result of this, you're going to see agreements with the Iraqi government and an eventual pullout of most U.S. troops by about 2011. Now, the question of does the surge or is the surge kind of the thing that does it? It's still debated, of course, to this day, and certainly actions like the Sunni Awakening and a number of others are going to, be a part of that discussion for years to come. Thank you.